Hey, I got a really special lens and camera I want to talk about today. So join me, let's get started. Hey, thanks for joining me today. This story about this camera and lens that I want to tell you about is a bit of a trip down memory lane for me. It starts with a story about my father, who was in the Korean War. He served in a MASH unit. He managed to wrangle a job as the X-ray or radiology technician, and that gave him access to the dark room where they normally would process X-ray films. He could process his own camera film. He took a lot of pictures in Korea, and so I have pictures of that MASH unit, and it's pretty cool stuff. But anyway, he met my mom in Japan, and they eventually came back to the United States, and where they started a family. My dad got a job as a newspaper photographer for the Daily Oklahoman Times, and my dad was never the kind of guy that did things like everybody else. He always followed his own path, and so he was, everyone else was driving Chevys and Fords. He drove a Jag, and he loved to build things, and one of the things he built was this really amazing sequence camera. Now these sequence cameras, he built two of them, were made on Bell and Howell Eyemo movie cameras, 35mm movie cameras. And the Bell and Howell Eyemo was known for just being really tough. I mean, they're just almost unbreakable. In fact, the Eyemo is still used in Hollywood in certain uses, especially like inside cars and things like that, because they're just about indestructible. So my dad mounted a 400mm kill fit lens, that's one of these, on the front of that camera, and mounted the whole thing in an aluminum framework you can see in the pictures. And so if you thought that frames around video cameras were a kind of a new thing, nope, my dad was doing it back in the 50s. So this sequence camera that he built, the Bell and Howell Eyemo has a shutter that's a circular disc that has a 36-degree opening in it. So at 24 frames a second, your shutter speed is a 240th of a second. At 16 frames a second, it's a 160th of a second. So my dad made a new shutter disc with a 3.6-degree opening instead of 36 degrees, a tenth as big. And what that resulted in is at 24 frames a second, now you have a shutter speed of a 1/2400th of a second, or at say 16 frames a second, it's 1/1600th of a second. So much faster shutter speed. So with this lens mounted on the camera, and on top of this framework, he mounted a sport finder, or made a sport finder out of a precision aperture rifle sight, and a piece of plexiglass at the front with the opening in it allows you to have what in effect is a sport finder or a quick finder that you can see where the camera's pointed. Beside that, on the frame also is mounted half of a pair of binoculars, and inside these binoculars is a mask that gives you a rectangular field of view that matches the image of the camera. And this half pair of binoculars is mounted with a pair of vernier adjustable rifle scope mounts that allowed you to fine-tune or adjust the viewfinder so that it matched what the camera was seeing. Now, in between the lens and the camera was a NovaFlex reflex housing. This allowed you to be able to fine focus the camera and then flip the mirror up in the reflex housing and film with it. So it was only used for critical focusing. And then, of course, the camera held 100-foot rolls of 35mm film. It was a hand-cranked camera, so you had to wind it up, and then you could use it for sequence pictures. Now, this was used primarily for sports photography. The photographers from the Daily Oklahoman would take these cameras to football games, the OU Sooners and the Cowboys, the OSU Cowboys, and they would photograph football plays. And they, back then, sequence cameras, I mean, in the late 50s, there really wasn't anything with a motor drive that had any real speed to it. And these cameras could shoot, relatively slow, like 12 or 16 frames a second, or as much as 24. One of the cameras was even modified to go to 48 frames a second. So then you've got 1/4800th of a second shutter speed and 48 pictures per second. And back then, that was just unheard of. Nobody had that kind of capability. So what they would do is they would photograph the plays either from the sidelines or from on top of the press box, and then go back, process the film, go through the images and pick out images to put in the newspaper. And you know, it's 35 millimeter motion picture is half frame 35 millimeter, so the image is horizontal across the length of the film, and so you get you get a lot of images on a 100-foot roll. You could film quite a bit of stuff. So they use these sequence cameras for sporting events and that sort of thing. And he built 2 of these, and many years after my dad was away from the paper, the chief photographer of the Daily Oklahoman, who amazingly had worked there for, I don't know, probably over 40 years, brought me one of the sequence cameras. The other sequence camera was donated to a Photography Hall of Fame museum that used to be here in Oklahoma City but has since been moved to St. Louis. But I have this one sequence camera. So what I want to do today is use this lens mounted on an Olympus camera body to try to take some pictures and see, you know, kind of what that looks like. The image sensor size on Micro Four Thirds is not that dissimilar from half frame 35 millimeter. I think the half frame 35 millimeter is maybe slightly bigger, but they're pretty close. So I'm gonna put these together and see if we can take some pictures. Well, the next question is, how am I going to get this onto this, right? So these Kill-Fit lenses. Kill-Fit lenses were made in Germany by Heinz Kill-Fit. They made cameras as well as lenses. And this lens is, interestingly enough, this lens is makes a lovely sound when you unscrew the lens hood. This lens really is a very simple lens. It's what's called a cemented achromat. And a cemented achromat is a lens that just basically has 2 elements. There's a double convex lens cemented or glued to a lens that's concave on one side and either plano flat or slightly convex on the other. But it's just 2 pieces of glass cemented together. And it's a very similar design to what's used for telescopes. Now this lens is not a telephoto lens. This lens is actually what you would call a long focus lens, because the distance from the center of the lens to the image sensor or the film is actually 400 millimeters. It's not a compressed design like a telephoto. Most of your telephoto lenses aren't actually as long as the focal length. They use what amounts to a built-in teleconverter to magnify the image, make it shorter, to make the lens shorter and more compact. So yeah, Heinz Kill-Fit. You can see in the lens here, this is a 400 millimeter f4 lens. I'm sorry, f5.6 lens. And it's just, actually if you unscrew this front part of it right here, all the lens elements are just right here. All the rest of this is an empty tube except for the diaphragm, which is located right in this area. So, or the aperture. And it's got a nice deep lens hood on it. These lenses were a common design in their day. Some of the early long focus lenses from even some of the best manufacturers used this design. The lenses, even Leica had some long lenses that were just cemented achromats like these. And while that seems like a really simple design and maybe, you know, shouldn't be very good, it actually on a long lens like this can perform quite well. They're not super fast, but they actually do a pretty good job. So how do we get this onto my camera? Well, the back of this lens has an M39, or what you'd call a Leica screw mount threads on it, but you can't screw it directly onto, say, like a Leica screw mount camera. It's actually designed to have more distance between it, and it was done that way so that you could adapt it to a wide variety of cameras. So back in the 50s, you could buy adapters for Exacta, for Nikon, for, you know, some of the other 35 millimeter SLRs that were available at the time. The other thing that it was made to work with was a VisoFlex for a Leica camera. Now the VisoFlex, and this is a Viso 1, the VisoFlex was a mirror reflex housing. So you can see there's actually a mirror in there, and when I push the button, the mirror flips up. It's just like a 35mm SLR. This turned your 35mm rangefinder Leica camera into an SLR, in effect. And the distance from the back of this lens to the back of this is then correct to mount it on a Leica screw mount camera. So if I screw this onto the back of this lens and then take a Leica screw to micro 4/3 mount adapter and put on there, now it's ready to mount on my camera. So it should mount right on that camera. Now, how am I going to use this? Well, I'm going to lock the mirror up and use the electronic viewfinder in the camera. I'm not going to try to use this VisaFlex. I'm only using this because I don't have any Leica screw mount extension tubes that equal exactly this same length. If I had extension tubes that were exactly the correct length, I probably wouldn't do it this way. So we're going to get this mounted up and take it out, take some pictures, and see if we can look at the results. So let me get all set up here and we'll take some pictures. So I've got this all mounted up. I have a question for you guys. So when I mount a mirror reflex housing onto my mirrorless camera, so my mirrorless camera now has a mirror in front of it, does that make it a DSLR? I don't know. Kind of weird. Anyway, got this all set up. Got my image stabilization set at 400mm. Now this is on a tripod. Normally you wouldn't use image stabilization. I'm gonna take some pictures with it on and with it off. This tripod is it's a tilt-all. It's a good sturdy tripod, but that's a lot of lens, and so any kind of movement would end up with a less than sharp image. So there's a building over here with some antenna arrays on it that are really kind of interesting looking. I'm going to get these fine focused and take a couple pictures here. We'll see what they look like. So the EM5 Mark II has focus peaking, which is really helpful in fine-tuning that focus. I can also use the magnifier to really fine-tune the focus as well. So I'm going to stop down to f11, try to improve the image quality of the lens a little bit, and I think I'm going to set a self timer on here so I'm not touching the camera, like a 2-second self timer. Okay, this is giving me at f11 with this bright sunlight, it's giving me a 640th of a second with an ISO of 200. 2 seconds seems to be just about the right amount of time for the camera to settle down and stop vibrating. Okay, I'm going to turn the image stabilization off. See what that looks like. All right, go find something else to take a picture of. Okay, I've got the camera set up, shoot a picture of a little, well, not a pine tree, it looks like a fir. Anyway, little tree. It's actually a tree kind of like this one, whatever that is. Anyway, I'm not a tree guy. So, but it's got some nice detail on the trunk and some of the needles, and so I'm going to take a couple this way. Looking at, I've got this on auto ISO, and it looks like it's seeing at f11, it's using ISO of 320, still pretty low. At a shutter speed of 125th of a second. Let's take a couple with this. And on these pictures, I'm not really trying to do anything compositionally really great or anything. I just want to be able to see the image quality of the lens. So the subject material is really not that critical. Anyway, take a couple more and see what we can find. One of the things I wanted you to be able to see, I'm going to zoom in with my video camera here a little bit, is you can see the red fringing around those bright highlight areas. The lens is at f5.6. I'm going to stop it down to f11. It's going to shake a lot. I've really got this magnified. So there it is, stopped down to f11, and you notice how that red fringing cleaned up and kind of went away. If I open back up to f5.6, that red fringing really comes back. So you can see the improvement in stopping down this lens really is important. So I've got the lens pointed up at that architectural detail I showed you earlier. Take a couple pictures of this one. Okay. So I think that'll give us some images we can look at. Yeah, well, I hope you enjoyed looking at some of those images. I know they're nothing special to look at, but the thing I was wanting to kind of see is, you know, what we were we could achieve in terms of image quality with this, you know, what, 60-year-old lens, 65-year-old lens. So, you know, lens technology has improved dramatically, but, you know, photographers back in their day, you know, they used what they had, and at that time this was state of the art. So it's just kind of fun to go back and try some of these really cool lenses. And it's fun for me because this is a lens and camera setup that my dad put together. At some point, I guess I'm going to have to buy a 100-foot roll of 35mm film, maybe some Ilford HP5, and actually shoot some sequences with the camera and see what those look like. I'm probably just going to have to give that a try. Anyway, well, I appreciate you joining me this morning. If you would, please click the like and subscribe buttons, as I always appreciate that. And if you have any thoughts or questions, please don't hesitate to leave me a comment. And as always, thanks for watching.